Okay, everyone, if we could make a start, please. A very warm welcome to today's event. It's great to see everyone here at the Roman Society's conference celebrating the journal Britannia. Now, the eagle-eyed among you will have spotted that it is not yet at the point where we've reached volume 50 of Britannia, which is what we're sort of here to celebrate. But that's because we are preempting the publication of that in order to get a report on today's events into that volume. So the 50th will reflect, the 50th volume will reflect our reflections today. And our programme that Helen and I have put together is organised to enable reflection on what has happened in the last 50 years of the journal, or nearly 50 years of the journal, and of course how that reflects what's been happening in the archaeology of Roman Britain, and then also to look ahead to the future and what might appear in the next 50 issues of the journal looking forward. So I'm not going to speak for very long now, but I would like to make just a couple of announcements. So the loos just outside the door there, straight across the corridor. We'll be making an announcement about lunch a bit later. The format will be that each speaker will speak, obviously, and then we'll just have time for one or two questions, hopefully after each talk. And because all of the talks are being recorded, there will be a microphone available for people to ask questions at the relevant points. And also I'd like very much to thank a few people. So this event, of course, is organised under the aegis of the editorial committee of Britannia and with the support of the archaeology committee of the Roman Society. Great deal of the organisation has been done by Fiona Hara, the secretary of the society, and we've also, we'd like to thank the people recording the event, Terry and Gabby, and Greg and Valerie from the ICS, who've also helped us with the room and other arrangements. So thanks to all of those people, and then without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Hella, who will introduce the day with her short presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I thought we would kick off the day by actually thinking about the journal Britannia, which we're here to celebrate, and reflecting on the kind of things that have been published in Britannia. Now, Shepard Frere, the first editor of Britannia, did this in 2010. And he reflected mainly on the changing lengths of the volume, the changing cost of the volume, the number and length of papers. So basically we had many more shorter papers in the earlier editions, sources of funding, and the introduction of the computer and how that changed things. So what I thought I would do is look slightly more specifically at the volumes from 1999 to 2016. That's as far as I got, basically. So what I did is I went through the main papers and tried to group these papers in terms of what the main topic of them was. Now, this is very crude, obviously, but what you can see is there are excavation reports, there are site focused articles, so these are not necessarily presenting new excavations and section drawings and finds, but they're focusing on a single site. There are lots of artifact papers, there are lots of epigraphy or history papers, and then far fewer that are dealing with sculpture, theory, and science. Now, obviously, this is a really crude simplification, so I'm not saying that these papers don't have any theory in them, but they are not explicitly theoretical papers. The science papers, so then I've made a little database and you can dig into this information and, for example, see that the science papers are really wide-ranging, from fish in Roman Britain to recent papers on human remains and isotope analysis. So a very wide range, even though the number is quite small. Many things that I sort of totted up were things that you probably expect if you read Britannia every year. So, for example, if we looked at the ratio of military, urban and rural sites that are being published, we would probably all expect that military and urban are more strongly represented than the rural sites. But actually, there's a fair number of rural sites, and there are obviously many papers that are not dealing with one site type in particular. Again, we might expect this. So in terms of regional emphasis, the journal, many papers cover all of Britain, but Scotland, there are some that are specifically about Scottish or Welsh sites, and the majority is about England. And again, if you had to guess, you probably come up with a list that is quite similar to this one here. I don't know if people can read that at the back, but it's basically saying London a lot, Colchester, Silchester, and then Hadrian's Wall sites. So, those are the sites that are cropping up repeatedly in this sample. Something that perhaps is a bit less expected, I've looked at the authors. So I looked at the authors of these papers. Are they male or female? But sometimes I couldn't tell. So I put initials only. But obviously the majority are male, which reflects wider trends in the profession and so forth. I then tried to break that down by where were these people working. So if we look at, are the authors of Britannia papers, are they working in the university sector? Are they working for commercial units, museums or English heritage, or other? And you can see that although the numbers vary, so many of the contributors, or most of the contributors, work in university sector, and there are slightly more women there, but overall the proportion of women is relatively steady. This category is quite interesting. So these were people who don't state an affiliation at the end of their article. So, that's, I think, a good thing that we have contributors from a wide range of different areas. You can then look at what men and women write about, okay? So, and that is interesting again. So you can see that women are in line with the overall pattern, not as well represented on most areas, apart from science, although that's a smaller sample, probably represented by some people in the room here. And then artifacts, women write about artifacts. That's a really clear trend. And Ellen Swift, in a paper in 2007, has already demonstrated this and looked at this, looking at the proportion of women and men in Roman finds studies. There are lots of women, and they do very particular things. So women tend to write about small finds, while men tend to write about coins and pottery. So there you go. Another thing, so this was something that Shepard Frere talks about. Britannia is called a journal of Roman Britain and kindred studies. And he defines kindred studies as encompassing the late Iron Age, the wider empire, and the 5th century and later. And when he went through, he actually identified quite a number of papers that he classes as kindred studies. I'm not sure, I feel he's a bit optimistic about what he calls wider empire papers. I was perhaps slightly stricter, and I found that the vast majority are strictly concerned with Roman Britain, and relatively few are to do with the kindred studies. They fall relatively evenly across Iron Age, post-Roman and continental material. And again, I don't know if people at the back can read this, but I pulled out what these papers were, and they really varied. So there's quite a few about Iron Age coins, early medieval piracy, Gallo-Roman cats, a real different range of topics. But not very many, and I think that's something we could think about. There are also very few international contributors, so in the sense of people who are not based in the UK. So I picked out a few, and sometimes they write about British sites, sometimes they write about continental sites, or about, in this case, a metal worker whose products are found in Britain, but who is a continental metal worker. But they're quite rare. And again, that I think is something that perhaps we could hope to change in the future. I want to finish by saying that CUP, so Cambridge University Press, is now able to provide us with a lot of detailed information about who reads our journal and which bits are being read. So this gives you some basic information, how many people look at abstracts and full text views and that kind of thing. You can then break that down by paper and have a sort of highlight list of papers, and Andy's at the top there. And then there are all sorts of, there's Ellen, papers about Vindolanda, but it's quite interesting because it changes and it actually allows us to see what is most popular. We can see who downloads, mainly universities, but some continental and American institutions, British universities, but also some others. So we can look at that. And finally, we can think about social media engagement. Cambridge University Press gathers this data. Again, it's hard to see. I'll try to make this as big as possible, but they start from 2007. Nothing much happens until 2012, and then you begin to see social media engagement. And that can take the form of newspaper articles, and they represent this in different colours. So, for example, one of the PAS entries featured a cupid that was picked up in quite a number of news outlets. So 47 mentions of it out there. Or the inscription from Bostra that mentioned a centurion from Britain, that caused quite a stir on Twitter and Facebook. So we can actually track who is looking at our papers and what they're thinking about them. So to sum up, I think what this made me realise, or what this made me think about, was whether we can perhaps, going forward with Britannia, whether there's some things we could do slightly differently. A lot of the papers that people associate with Britannia are about the journal of record. And I wonder whether themed issues and issues that deal with specific debates and that stress the new theoretical frameworks that are being developed in the wider discipline, whether those will actually be something that will enrich Britannia in future. And I'm also really keen to see more on the kindred studies, however we define that, and in particular more papers that deal with the continental, put Britain into a continental context rather than study it in isolation. And in that way, I think hopefully we will continue for another 50 years with this excellent journal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hella. Time for perhaps one quick question. Anybody has a... do you think, there's potential for comparison with other kind of the big journals like PPS and Medieval, and do you think, I'm curious about how much things are changing over time, or if there is change detectable. Do you see signs
it would be really interesting to do this for the whole of Britannia anyway. I quit in 1999 just running out of time. But, I'm thinking of going back further and carrying out the same exercise because that would give a more long term. And I know people have done it for PPS, haven't they?
Yeah.
Bob Chapman did that.
Yeah, and there's another paper, I think, a few years ago.
Yeah, so that'd be worse.
Yeah, great. Okay. Thank you very much.